Good morning, afternoon, or evening, folks, and welcome to Cast of All Trades, the show where we talk about developing skills, exploring ideas, and following curiosity. I'm your host, Orion Siebert, and in this episode, I sit down with my former Taekwondo teacher, Chris Correia. He has earned black belts across a number of different disciplines, taught Taekwondo for years, and has since been using his knowledge of martial arts to help the blind. I asked Master Chris about his journey through martial arts, a story about a boy who is fascinated by the craft, who started and stopped for many years, until finally his son brought him into martial arts for good. While this episode is a little rambly at times, I'm confident that by the end of it, you'll have a good idea about what the martial arts journey is like, the skills and benefits you can gain from training, where to begin, and much more. I know personally this is a fun interview for me to have. I love being able to sit down and chat with Master Chris every once in a while to catch up and to see how things are going. And for me, this is a fun way to look back and think about the world of martial arts, how I started, to reflect on what happened to that little 5-year-old kid that started Taekwondo all those years ago. How has the teachings of my former teacher been able to help me throughout the years? And this is a fun episode for me to reflect back on that. If you're enjoying these interview-styled episodes, I have good news for you. I have another upcoming interview coming soon, next week, with a communications expert, Nicole Karnowski. We sit down and talk about all sorts of communications, talking about public speaking, presentation, and how we can improve our communication skills. If that's something that interests you, then don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out. I think that about covers it. So, without further ado, introducing Master Chris Correia. Master Chris, it's a pleasure to have you on today.
Hey, I'm really happy and touched to be asked to be part of this with you.
Of course. And I guess before we really dive into it, just want to say, while I was researching and prepping for the show, I was reminded of the diversity of work that you've done over the years. So, first off, I want to really thank you for being such an incredible influence on my life as a Taekwondo master and instructor. And also, just as I look through your LinkedIn profile and going through some of the stuff you've been writing and talking about more, I want to commend you for your wide range of professional experiences with your work with being a director consultant with BNI, running your own martial arts gym, and some of the other services that you've done over the years. So just want to say thank you for that. You've done great work.
Well, thank you for paying attention and acknowledging. And by the time I get done saying whatever I might share in the course of this podcast, I hope I haven't showed the wizard behind the curtain uh, by the time we're done, because that's what a lot of life can feel like sometimes. That's a pretty common thing talked about these days, whether it be called imposter syndrome or whatever else it might go on. Is I think that a lot of times it can just come down to humility in terms of realizing, um, what you are and what you're not. And hopefully that's something that I've gained over time from all those experiences.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I wanted to bring you on to this episode primarily first and foremost to focus on talking about fitness and martial arts first. And then once we get through that and get a good foundation there, I wanted to maybe touch on some of your social work experiences and some of the other stuff you've been working on since then. Does
Mhm.
that sound good?
Yeah, that's fine.
Great. So, Master Chris, starting off simple, who are you and how did you first get into practicing martial arts? I'd love to hear that story again.
Oh, wow. Well, the who are you? That's I don't quite know what to say about that one. Only because when you think about getting called onto a podcast and um, it's like what differentiates one person from another person, and when it comes to some things like martial arts or nonprofit work or anything else it might be. I mean, there's people of so much greater caliber, experience, knowledge, ability than I have ever brought to the game. And but at the same time, I just recently found myself commenting in a number of different ways. Something I thought kind of wrote about it in regards to the notion of influence is we look to the big voices for the celebrity, the popular, and it doesn't mean not quality even, but the big voices for advice and perspective. And yet, mostly we're all average people living average lives, doing the best we can, trying to achieve whatever our version of success and happiness are, and relate to other people well. And you just, all the person next door or the person down the hall or upstairs or in the next cubicle or whatever it might be, and that there's, an awful lot about life that one can learn and about living just by the people around you. So
Hmm.
uh, I'm a person around you is what I'm
Yeah.
leading to with that, in that
Well,
regard.
there's some great advice in there actually that I would like to touch on briefly. That we often do turn to celebrities and
Mhm,
people who are
mhm,
like big in whatever world that we look at for advice,
mhm,
and yet oftentimes the best advice we can get is from someone who's maybe one, two, three steps ahead of us. I think
mhm,
back to when I was like in like second grade or in kindergarten. I didn't care about what high school's life was like. I cared more about, oh, what's the next grade going to be like? What's two grades ahead of me going to be like?
mhm,
When I was 5 years old, the cool kids were seven, and I always wanted to know, what is that like? What's life like a couple steps ahead of me? Since world, like me being a 5 year old thinking about what it's like being an adult, I had no idea what that was like. I personally didn't care what that was like. At the same time, what I did care about was the people who were just a little bit ahead of me. So
mhm,
even if it is just the people around you, oftentimes they're ahead of you a little bit in some
mhm,
way, shape, or form. And they're the best
mhm,
people to ask for advice on,
mhm,
well, what they're a little bit ahead in. So I think
mhm.
that might be part of why I thought you would be a great person to come on today, because I feel like you are just a bit ahead of some people, or you're better at reflecting back at what it was like to be just a little bit ahead, or being back in like the shoes of a beginner.
Oh, if I had any role in helping to impart that perspective or that wisdom in you, I'll happily take credit for it because that's really good. I like that. Thinking about that, and uh, actually something I hadn't considered in that notion of the influence and trying to seek advice or lessons from, um, if not big names, at least people that are so far ahead in some ways. And a lot of that might be apparent because they have a big voice in terms of that kind of popularity or celebrity. But in any case, with those folks, there's all those steps in between that are the ones that are the important ones, those different phases along the way, as opposed to where one is now, say me sitting here and listening to, someone else talk. I just read Arnold Schwarzenegger's latest book, and I love that guy and really like the book. And so I'm actually close to him in age, but in terms of certain kinds of accomplishments, it's man, if I was reading that stuff at this point in time that he wrote now, 30 years ago, and many other things that might have read 30 or 40 years ago, I wasn't ready to hear it. It was too far beyond me. I needed that next step.
Mm-hmm.
That next Taekwondo class, just showing up to the next one or talking to the person that's a purple belt when I'm only still a yellow belt, a few steps up, whatever it might be, as opposed to somehow relating to the master instructor who's a fourth or fifth degree black belt. You just person's walking around in a seemingly different place than you are, and it's hard to learn from that. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a great perspective in terms of that. And I'm smiling about the grades because I can answer your question somewhat that way about getting into Taekwondo. That's not quite that, but I know how you got in because you were in one of those elementary school grades when I started teaching you and your brother,
Yep.
and at the Edison School gym after school, and which was, as we look back to that later, how I took that step from instructing to teaching. That was actually the step at that point in time for what was open. Um, but how I got into the martial arts
Mm-hmm.
initially, it's because of my son, who Rob, and but there is history beyond that because when I was a kid, I got somehow connected up and interested in, as kids do lots of things. I was pretty imaginative. I was an only child, spent a lot of time alone, in some ways, possibly raised myself and found my influences and interests on my own. And one of the things that became is at least looking at through reading libraries, it wasn't internet back then, and there wasn't a whole lot on television, books, and including martial arts books. Just happened to come across some once when I was there, I guess, in the children's section. And then along the way, just, maintained some interest, buying magazines off the stands and never had an opportunity, like the newsstands, and never had an opportunity to learn. Um, you know, any given town or smaller city might not have a martial arts program of some sort. And by the time I would ever come around to looking, wondering, looking in the yellow pages, as places advertised back then, the one place in town that I'm remembering existed at this point in time, just the picture of, that they had in there of a couple of guys doing something, wearing their black uniforms, intimidated the heck out of me. I was afraid to think that if I walk in that place, even if they, took someone at whatever age it might have been, say 12, would I be able to handle that? Because I didn't feel particularly athletic or capable in any way, and that wasn't my background at all. So, and then as it happened, when I went to college, just saw a poster stuck up someplace that there was going to be a judo club, and I was a freshman, and again, came out of a background completely not athletic, had been an overweight kid. Losing weight in my high school years and going to college just because I was tired of being overweight doesn't mean I was fat. I was just skinny,
Mm-hmm.
and hadn't played a lot of sports and all, and hadn't done well largely, I think, at this point in time because of my vision. Aside from when you're overweight as a kid, you can't do sports very well. I was blind in one eye, and no one ever told me that that's going to mess stuff up for you. You won't be able to catch and hit and do all this stuff very well. It was just what it was. So,
Yeah, that'll
kind of
make a little difference when trying to catch a football or kick something in a certain direction.
yeah, yeah. And, I've learned over time that you actually can accommodate for that by a lot of practice and experience, but you also don't get the opportunity to practice when you suck. I mean, because
Mm-hmm.
you're getting picked last and you're getting stuck out in right field, and you're not in the backyard taking lots of swings with your, well, as we played it, with your fist on the pinky ball that we played baseball with, handball, and school as a pickup game in the schoolyard much of the year. And so I saw that judo club thing pop up, and I just got curious enough to check it out. And it only existed about two-thirds of the year, maybe, if half a year, because the instructor actually moved and his assistant couldn't continue on. But I had a little glimpse at that point in time that just showing up equally with other people, no expectations, just um, that, I did okay. I did as well as anyone in the room. And when I was more confident in some classes because I felt like I was getting it, I actually did better, as opposed to the way you might hold back and not apply yourself when you're not confident to something, which, that can be a lifelong challenge no matter how good you are at something. It's a big
Mm-hmm.
lesson to be learned. And uh, it kind of stopped when that was done, and that was it. And we kind of enjoyed it, but maintained, just that peak of interest. And then moved to a different part of town off campus. This is in Providence, Rhode Island. I was going to Providence College, and the bus stop that I switched off at, maybe in my junior year, taking the bus into school from a different neighborhood, was in front of a Weichiru karate school that was up on the second floor. One of those, you just see a sign of it floating up there, and the entrance is kind of this dark doorway that goes up this big narrow staircase in a old downtown building up to a second floor. And
Only the
went
most
up there, and
stereotypical like
it
movie
was
back alley.
exactly. Except this wasn't, there was an alley close by actually that went down the side, but this was an official doorway. And met this guy who was, well, actually, our master instructor, as we were kind of like coming up together under master, Master Bruce Soto, big guy,
Mm-hmm.
he was 6'5" or so. Well, Charles Earl must have been, not quite that big, but close to that. I guess probably the size of my son, who's a little bit smaller. And he greeted me in his little office that was just at the top of the stairs, and I started classes there and progressed along, and maybe went through what would be the equivalent of a couple of belt promotions, but then dropped out for some reason. And I think it was largely my own life busyness and screwiness as a college student, and screw around in some other ways. But then also a pattern I picked up on later that I even saw in people in martial arts is you can start off with interest in something and even be doing well at it, but you can hit a point where you quit because you just kind of don't want to go to the next level where you might be more challenged and possibly, find yourself failing more.
Mm-hmm.
Fear of that failing. And so I think that was part of my motivation in that. And I think sometime after I graduated from college, but was still in town, I showed up there again and started back up for a little period of time until I moved out of town. And when I walked in, Charles Earl or Sensei Earl said, I've thought about you. I wondered if you'd ever come back, and I did. But then it was short-lived because of moving and travel for classes wouldn't have been too convenient at that point in time, or at least I didn't want to make that commitment. And kind of sat idle for a long time until eventually, again, a few years later, just probably still buying the occasional martial arts magazine, I stopped at, I realized in Boston, Massachusetts, and I was living in southeastern Massachusetts, so call it an hour away from Boston South, that this Chinese Tai Chi and Wushu instructor, Bo Sim Mark, the small little woman who was acknowledged as like one of the best in China, uh, and then moved to the U.S., that she had a school in Boston. And so didn't have a car at that point in time, but I had a period of 6 months where every Saturday morning I went to the bus terminal and took a bus up to Boston from Fall River, Massachusetts, my hometown where I moved back to. Walked from the bus terminal over to Chinatown, took a couple hours of classes, and then bus back down, and kept that going until at that point in time I think it stopped because I was relocating to St. Louis, and likewise in St. Louis had some similar start stop a couple of times with a couple of different martial arts, and it seemed like that 3 to 6 month range was the sweet spot for starting and then letting something else take over, whether it be it psychological or life-wise,
Mm-hmm.
and never really getting past that. So I dabbled an awful lot in a few different areas, but never picked up much of anything along the way aside from maintaining some interest. And my longest gap was probably from the time moving from St. Louis to Duluth, and then having say a few years from that last experience in St. Louis, and then in Duluth, having my start that took me in contact with you eventually, which was in Taekwondo of all arts, compared to others I thought I had interest in, and that was because of my son, who uh, punched a kid in the nose at daycare, and I think my wife was the one who came up with the notion of having read something about martial arts helping self-control and teaching proper lessons about violence and such, and looked around a little bit, and Master Bruce's brand new program at that point in time, because he was new to town, it was really the only place I could get him into because he wasn't quite 5 years old yet, and so uh, some schools didn't really have kids programs, or they had an age cutoff, and
Mm-hmm.
the thing that could happen with Master Bruce, and so this is pretty special, is he only had one class going. He was working, full-time day job and subleasing some space for gym, and it was a mixed class. His wife and his own two a little bit older children were in there, and then there were teenagers and some other adults, and just a hodgepodge of people all together. And no one as young as Rob, aside from his two kids who were several years older than Rob was. And I heard about it through the grapevine. Someone said they saw a sign, and it was pretty informal, grassrootsy kind of thing at that point in time. Uh, Called him, got a number, called him, went up and met him. Rob and I tried a class out together, which was under the guise of Rob trying class because he was the one that we wanted to sign up for classes. But then what Master Bruce made the offer was because Rob was so young, that I'd have to join along with him. So he was able to leverage that into two students instead of one, as crafty as he was at that point in time.
Wise
Because I think
business move.
yeah, Rob would have been just fine. He was a phenom of sorts. He at that point in time, kids did the same testing curriculum as adults, essentially, and he just went through training literally with adults as physical partners in rotation as a granted tall, taller, bigger sized 5 year old, by the time we got rolling, practically five. And, I think he was the youngest junior black belt that had ever gone through at least that Greenquist system at the time that Rob tested for his junior black belt, and
Mm-hmm.
and did great. In fact, he had a chance to test for black belt before me, so I could not go to his junior black belt test, So,
Well,
and never stopped after that, So how did I get in? A whole bunch of dabbling that doesn't amount to anything because, as you know, when you're just kind of involved in a martial art for such a short period of time, even a year potentially, but certainly 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months, it's really nothing. It's part of a longer process unless all you're learning are some very specific, narrow focused, street self-defense tricks or something like that.
hmm I will say I did not know you had such a varied background dabbling in
Mhm.
different martial arts. I knew about you starting Taekwondo
Yes, sir.
with your son
Mhm,
Rob, but
mhm,
I did not know
mhm,
about the Judo, the karate, the Tai Chi,
mhm,
like that. That was a whole new aspect of that that I had never
mhm.
even heard about before.
Yeah.
But
Well, I would talk about it some when people ask, but largely, it became irrelevant. It's like life started at 30. Martial arts life really started at 33 years old when I started with a 4, not quite 5-year-old kid in this, more or less mixed ages class of sorts in a in an upstairs wooden floored, probably former dance studio or something like that, in downtown Duluth, Minnesota. And I mean, I was expecting to realistically get Rob rolling, and when it looked like he could continue on his own, probably quitting. Partly because I just didn't see myself at that point in time of being 33 years old, still not physically active, major beyond dad bod going on
mhm.
in terms of status and
It's
physical
not the
status.
vision you
And
have of a martial artist.
no, and on top of it, I had always considered Taekwondo with what I knew about it from books, magazines, whatever references, as being a pretty hard-ass martial art.
hmm
They would talk about explosive power, kicking, jumping, spinning stuff. I'm thinking I'm Mr. Tai Chi, not Mr. Taekwondo.
hmm
And that's what I was getting on the beginning of there. I just had a reflection recently because our director at work was a nonprofit where I work, the Lighthouse. She was referencing how when she started, well, at this point, I guess it's probably 12 or 13 years ago. I don't know, but whatever point she started, she was, there weren't a lot of people younger than her there. Largely they had been around and older, and she came in, and she wasn't terribly young, but still it was skewed up older ages. And with some programs expanding and new hiring right now, there's quite a mix of people that are younger, which kind of means, even under 30, under 35, just in that general range. And which means I'm like one of the old guys. I might be the oldest guy working there right now. That's crazy. Um, and but she mentioned these younger people, and I put myself in that context of, oh my God, I'm the old guy here, in the organization. I'm a couple years older than our director,
hmm
and I happen to be thinking of martial arts, this interview coming up, and some other stuff, and I've been drawing upon Taekwondo and my experience and tenets and various things like that as helping me get through some tough stuff, the last few months, with work and other life stuff. And I just kind of paused and I realized back in 1993, when Rob and I first started Taekwondo, that was 31 years ago. And while some of these people weren't even born or were in, kindergarten or whatever the status was at that point in time, that's when I started doing 20 knuckle push-ups on a hardwood floor in that gym upstairs in Duluth, Minnesota. And everything that happened since then, and I put it in the context of 1990, I'm sorry, 2003, my first Korea training trip with a group of black belts and great Grandmaster Yuan, our kind of systems founder, for a week of what was regarded as his hell or hellish training. I
hmm
think the way it was phrased in the
Sort of the
material
boot
that
camp equivalent of
that went
Taekwondo.
out. Yeah, kind of, martial arts certification opportunities rolled in with just a bunch of really hard training at any hour of the day or night, literally, and with any amount of moments notice. And that was even, then 21 years ago, not 31 years ago. So like that's, I was going through that as a third degree black belt and going to test for rank in a couple other adjunct arts over in Korea and going through that week of training as a whole different experience when half of my coworkers were just, children and uh, barely out of kindergarten for many of them potentially, and it just gave me some life perspective in a different way for the first time. It was just because it was rotate the angle of the frame or the lens a little bit, and you just kind of see things a little different ways. So that comment about the age of our staff that we have at the lighthouse just kind of opened up some different perspective for me just within the last couple of weeks. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember. I remember. I sort of vaguely remember starting up Taekwondo when I was, oh, it would have had to be. I'm pretty sure I was just in kindergarten at that time. So
mhm.
just little 5-year-old Taek. So probably about the same age as when Rob started.
Yeah,
That.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that was in your elementary school gym at the Kenwood School, Kenwood
Mm-hmm.
Edison, and that gym floor was that tile over concrete kind of floor.
Yep.
And so just the notion of being at risk of teaching these elementary age students, fifth grade was the oldest, uh, Taekwondo, which involves trying to get them to spin and kick and jump over time and landing on that thing. I was always worried one of you guys is for sure in any given class going to walk away with a busted arm or something because it was pretty tough training experience. So
Yeah, kids are resilient.
yeah,
Break a bone, you
yeah,
can walk
well,
it off.
yeah. Well, at that point in time, I was willing to take a fall on that floor too, and for demonstrations and all would be called upon to be one of the fallers a lot of times because I did it pretty well for getting thrown around, regardless of the surface. And now I'll tell you, the older you get, the harder the floor gets. Doesn't matter if it's a carpet
Mm-hmm.
or a pad. So,
Right. So you briefly mentioned this as you were telling your story about how you've transitioned from
mhm,
martial art to martial art,
mhm,
eventually landing on Taekwondo with Rob.
mhm.
But how did you go from being a Taekwondo practitioner to actually starting to teach or being an instructor for it?
Well, you mentioned the Kenwood School being that first step, and so as you know, within our particular Taekwondo system, and what a lot of people might not know, and I guess more broadly, it's pretty much still this way in Taekwondo. It certainly was with our particular branch, and it's like if you're not a master instructor, you're not doing anything on your own. I mean, you're always under someone else if you're staying affiliated within some system and tradition or branch. And so as a new at that point in time, first degree black belt from the prior summer, Master Bruce had started that after school program as a way of building his program more because it had become more established at that point in time, and he was looking at other ways of expanding. And after school programs were something that were a possibility, but he couldn't maintain it. He was looking for someone else to pick it up.
Mm-hmm.
And I was still working full time for a nonprofit that we had moved to Duluth, so I could take that job. But I had the opportunity 2 days a week to get, because Kenwood ended a little late. You had a long school day there. That was one of the features of that school. So I was able to get out of work, on time or early a little bit to go zip a little bit up the hill and teach an after school program and pick that up from them. So it was probably I think it was January, February, sometime early in must have been 1997, perhaps, sometime around there that I started going there to teach elementary age kids as a 6 month old first degree black belt, 36-year-old guy maybe or something like that, 37,
Mm-hmm.
and it was just a step out into teaching to do something to help my instructor to feel good about teaching taekwondo. Uh, just to get that opportunity, and if anything, those kind of things were generally pushed and encouraged by instructors if they're looking at expanding a system because the program was mine to run in regards to I register students and I can make some money doing it and all of that. But largely it was, all of the testing, promotion, that sorts of stuff that's reserved for, fourth degree black belts and up. You're not allowed to do that kind of testing in Taekwondo unless you are at that level rank. The run of the mill first dan is still kind of like your high school graduate, as I always thought of it. Your black belt's your high school diploma. And after that, at least in Taekwondo it is. And then you can start working from there. And I know there are other traditions, I don't know a lot about it, but like, say a jujitsu, Gracie jujitsu tradition, by the time you get your black belt, probably the equivalent of master instructor in Taekwondo, and that's a first dan, but it takes you a long time to get there. Taekwondo kind of
Mm-hmm.
takes a little different approach. Um, all kind of gets you to the same place, but you just got to keep it in perspective of what a black belt does and doesn't mean in different traditions, you know. So
Mm-hmm.
I always looked at it as my high school diploma. Once I got past it, I was just like, oh my God, I'm just really starting to, learn seriously now. Now I'm getting into it. That was just the gateway to the opportunity to learn more. If you're stuck around that long, then someone knows they can trust you and count on you maybe if you keep sticking around to do more and you get a chance to learn more too, as well as contribute more. So,
Mm-hmm. You mentioned there you started off with teaching these young elementary school kids. Before starting teaching Taekwondo, did you have any experience with teaching or with like, working with kids like you did?
not significant. Well, not significantly. I want to say at the same time, my wife would probably say, no, no, remember, we coached Rob's soccer team, and that was
Good
true.
old Little
Rob
League.
was a third grader at that point in time. Yeah, yeah. Well, no, I had trauma from baseball when I was a kid because of my vision, so I never quite stuck and went back to baseball or little league. Although I probably coach it coach it pretty well. I did find that I had an affinity for being able to coach, teach, work with kids pretty well. I think for whatever reason,
Mm-hmm.
maybe just a sensitivity that you end up getting or not. Maybe it was going back to my being in the position I was in as a kid, and you always have the standout kids that hardly need coaching and instruction. They just go at it and do it. They're confident. They got some physical gifts to go behind it. They've learned that they're good at it, and they'll just jump into an activity. But awful lot of kids need some degree of nurturing, of some push and encouragement. Whatever that might be. So maybe because of my own background of not being into some sports, I kind of taught and coached the way I imagined I would want to be taught and coached as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And But we did have the experience of a soccer team, which at that point in time was the real little ones, probably the essentially the 5 and 6 year olds. And as you know, the city of Duluth hillside uh, area was where we lived and where the team was based, the Hillside Hawks, and it was literally the ragtag group of kids that couldn't afford uniforms and just played in the very basic yellow, poorly logoed T-shirt compared to some of the other teams that we played against in town. And this ragtag group of kids, in many ways, we actually did okay. And at that point in time, I had been in the Taekwondo gym as a student, but still working with kids and assisted instructing, and took that and turned that into further um, uh, help in the soccer. But here I am just realizing what the chicken and egg was. And it's like there was especially when I came up in the Taekwondo system, there was kind of the expectation if you were able that you contribute back by assisting in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that Master Bruce needed the assisting by the time I got the black belt or even those higher color belts was that he had added some separate kids classes, and Rob had transitioned into those at some point in time, after a few years of training, and I would show up and try to help on some basis. So between the general assistant instructing and that particular kids work, that provides a natural foundation for then going out and teaching on your own. If you went out to just teach on your own and it was cold and um, you were in a program the way that requirement and opportunity wasn't there to really work with others and teach others. You just don't have those skills. So that was part of that foundation. So,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah.
I'll tell you that that soccer team experience was just good to think in terms of really taking someone from a point A to point B in a different context and applying some of the same principles a different way. And I think that's one thing that you find, and sometimes it can be building an organization, building up a taekwondo program, teaching people, beginner, white belt to some other point. Yes, I guess similarities pop up there, and you take one, you can carry it over to the other, as long as you realize, what you've done isn't a gospel truth, but it's just some guidelines and principles that can guide you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Years back, I also briefly I had a little stint when I was a little soccer player. Probably when I was, I want to say 5, 6, or 7, but definitely not the the well, the superstar player whatsoever. I
Mhm,
was more like the kid chasing butterflies off in the corner.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah, but
Well, yeah, well, it's always fun for me to look back on, it could be in different sports and activities, but the neat thing about a martial art, and I know one of your questions to get to, which I'm not saying we should get to it now, but just that notion of, you know, advice on people starting is that it really is a case where despite whatever impression people get of what it means to be a black belt, what it means to be a martial artist, and especially now, martial arts standard is, looking at ultimate fighting on television, which is, a whole different kind of thing,
mm-hmm.
and yet comes from the same, oftentimes can start at the same roots as, you or I started in, um, that, oh boy, here we go. That's one where I kind of lost track of where I was going with that one. I know you can edit out, so that's okay. Um, the Well, I'm going to let that one go right now because
It's
whatever
fine. Train has left the
stray,
station.
stray thought came up, I started changing tracks.
Mm-hmm. It's all good. It
Yeah,
happens.
yeah,
I guess
that's it.
since you already started to touch on that a bit, on what it takes to, like, what it takes for someone who's starting off, how about we
Mhm.
how about we start touching on that a bit more? Where you've worked with all kinds of people learning
Yeah.
Taekwondo for the first time. Some adults, some kids. Like I said before, I started when I was 5, when I was a
Mhm.
little kindergartner, and one of the few core memories that I have was I was, of being too weak to break my first board for my first belt test. So I
Mhm.
had to have one of the black belts help me do it,
Mhm.
and I bring that up because when someone is approaching martial arts and particularly Taekwondo for the first time, what are some key principles that they might want to know or that you might recommend that they start with to get started on the right foot?
Well, I guess drawing off even more so my own experience in terms of what would draw me in and keep me in versus and keep pulling me back in because heck, I had many steps along the way in Taekwondo where I thought of quitting for one reason or another. And things grab you different ways. But in terms of that, if not advice, perspective on the front end for somebody is that it's martial arts or any. It's okay to suck. It's okay to be a beginner.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, there'll be many opportunities along the way where you are a beginner. When you are a newly minted black belt, and then you have a chance to go to trainings that involve a lot of other black belts of varied ranks and experience. You feel like a beginner. You're going in there and you're just the new guy again, or the new girl, new woman. And then another part is part of that willing to be a beginner and knowing that you might suck is that's typical. That's anybody is remaining. That's another part of being remaining open to what you might learn. My going back to that Taekwondo, I had a reason that I ended up in a Taekwondo school. It's because of the school that we could be in or Rob could be in, and I would have probably joined any program. It might not involve me if it had been a program that had kids like one or two of the others did, but they just needed you to be, 7 or 8 years old or whatever the cutoff was then. I would have been dropping off my boy, maybe watching him and taking him home. So in some ways, ended up where we ended up, and I always look back at things like that and wonder, like, wow, was there a reason and some guidance for that happening in some way? Because look where it went. Um, uh, but it does have to be a good feeling when you start, especially martial arts, because so much can be wrapped up into that. But some sort of other group activity, but
Mm-hmm.
could be comparable. But a martial art's a martial art. I mean, there's still a lot of things that go along with it in terms of capability and however it crosses gender is just the concept of toughness and machismo, and or the counterbalance of that, or what women might experience stepping into a gym in terms of capability or intimidation or whatever it might be. There's all these dynamics, and one of the biggest things I just think was uh, a blessing to be able to do in instructing martial arts, especially as I built up and wanted to have and maintain my own program of different ages was taking in somebody, no matter who they were, what their interest was, what their capability was, what their wondering and fear was, be it a woman that actually had been assaulted, to an older, man in his 60s that always had the interest and started bringing his grandson and, maybe took martial arts in college, but that ship sailed a long time ago on him. And, and then his wife gets interested and it's like how to actually have them do real martial arts and stay in and work within the mixed group and nurture that individual. I mean, that's, the thing that grateful I could have developed a skill in, as many, good instructors have developed that skill. But you can come in wherever you are at, and if you have the interest or the wondering, the curiosity, just know that if you walk in there and you have a pretty good feeling talking to the instructor, getting a sense of what's going on in the room, in the program, maybe talking with some other students, give it a shot and know that you're just starting off as a beginner like anybody else. And um, it'll keep showing up, it'll come along. And at the same time, if it seems like it's not for some reason, or you realize your connection wasn't so great, I think a big one is don't be afraid to quit. I mean, it really is true too, because you don't want to end up in something that's just not good. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe at some point in time, you just pick up on something about it that just makes you want to think, maybe I should leave, but you get those mixed feelings of, are you a quitter? And people putting pressure on you in different ways, and um, feel free to start, explore, fail, um, be free to quit. But at the same time, unless there's a lot of red flags going on, or you just realize something completely it just isn't there for you in some way, if you had that interest and you showed up and basically it's a good experience, just continue to show up. Just stick with it, because you never know. You don't know what it's like to be those three steps ahead, like you just referenced
Mm-hmm.
earlier at the beginning of the show, until you kind of like stick around long enough to see. And the more you kind of see that happening, it does build a little bit momentum. When
Mm-hmm.
you're a white belt, you realize that, in fact, oh, I can make it to yellow belt, a couple steps later, and then later on, I can the hard one to imagine is brown belt, actually, when you look specifically in a lot of karate systems and taekwondo systems. That brown belt becomes one of those pre-black belt levels all of a sudden, so
Mm-hmm.
and unless there's all kinds of black belts and masters running around a room to where there it seems like they're a dime a dozen, and color belts are just different colors. Man, I know in any karate school that I walked into, judo, when the person was a brown belt, they were, that step away from black belt for all intents and purposes, and they had a different mystique about them. So,
Mm-hmm.
but even then, you can be that one belt away from that, and it can seem like such a big step, but at least it's just one step, and by that point in time, you get some perspective on that. That if she did it, if he did it, I can do it, or at
Mm-hmm.
least I got a decent shot at it, So,
Yeah. So some of the stuff that you briefly touched on there, I want to dig a bit more into of
mhm,
different reasons why people start doing
mhm,
martial arts. Or I guess the question I want to dig into is, what do you see as, like, why do a lot of people start martial arts today, and what is maybe some of the reasons or the purpose of martial arts in our modern day, in your opinion?
Yeah, and you had that question on a think about sheet a little bit, and that's a good answer. I mean, it's a good question because the answer really is individualized. I still, even though well, coincidentally, it was going to be the COVID year, and I wanted to kind of like retire, and things just went bust as COVID hit, and things weren't even active at the time. I planned on having them go transitioned, so we never that our program never started back up,
It's a little
partly
hard to
because of
do
that.
martial arts in a gym
Yeah.
when no one can come to the gym.
Yeah. And I just couldn't make the commitment at that point in time to continue on myself. It was time to just stop, and
Mm-hmm.
tied into different family milestones and a variety of things. And so, but uh, the I still teach at this point in time because I partly got connected to the Lighthouse, which serves people who are blind and beyond that now with some other disabilities. But my focus is the blindness training program. My first connection to the Lighthouse back when I had my Taekwondo program going, I think it was 2012. I had a thought of uh, driving by the Lighthouse in Duluth as it was once. Gee, I wonder what's up with people who are blind in self-defense. and then ended up, teaching some programs on, limited week basis, 12 weeks or whatever, to some cohorts of people who are blind and visually impaired. And uh, so even still teaching now, continue to see what's the perspective of why people have that interest, and in this case, someone literally walking around who's maybe never seen in their entire life, or went from not seeing all of a sudden, and what their interest in self-defense might be. And so, across the whole range, there could be practical need and value for wanting to feel like you can take care of yourself in some way in what you might see as a potentially dangerous world. And yet, that's true. So a lot of people do enter wanting to just know that they've increased their um, uh, tools in their toolbox a little bit for taking care of themselves, as I like to think about it. There's no magic formula. There's no magic technique. It's just everything you do is going to help your case, and certainly having some training where you've used your body and learned some techniques and applied yourself in physical encounters in different ways you might in a taekwondo school, it's certainly not going to hurt and could help an awful lot. And at the same time, though, to think you walk into a martial arts school and you can come out as, years and years later as someone highly capable and trained, that's not a guarantee that you're going to be safe either. So,
Mm-hmm.
someone can always be bigger, faster, stronger, or shoot you, or whatever it might be. The element of surprise, things change. So you've increased your odds, but ultimately, personal safety and how you carry yourself in the world are bigger things than that. So even with self-defense as a primary concern that some people might have entering the gym, I think ultimately most people going in want some sense of confidence and capability and fulfillment in a way that goes even beyond their physical capability. And great Grandmaster Yun, he was real big on confidence. I think it probably came down from him where he noted that the biggest thing that we're doing with our students is to build confidence, because even if you are highly skilled as a fighter, if you don't have really a good confidence to go along with that, half the battle is already lost. That confidence has to be there. And most of the encounters that people are going to hit in life, as when they are a martial artist and they practice for a bit, be it the kindergarten or the first grader at Ken Edison School, or someone who's older and worried about their physical ability as they're deteriorating in their 60s, going into their 70s, and anyone in between. Just that sense of capability and confidence, that's what's going to carry you throughout the day and give you kind of some sense of peace of mind and happiness in life, is that you just carry that sense with you.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree that martial arts has this ability to help someone build confidence in themselves by, I guess, developing yourself physically, whether that be through fitness, through working out, by like maybe bodybuilding, or through just getting good at doing exercise, or being able to do something with your body. There's something about that builds an innate level of confidence in yourself to say, I've been able to accomplish and be able to do this thing. What else can I do? Where I have some base level of ability to say, I know I can physically do this thing that maybe not everyone can do, or I know I've put in more effort than many other people have to try to get good at this thing. That can often give some level of confidence to say, I can go out and do other things now. I can try other things. I can experiment. I can go out and like not be as afraid of the world.
Yeah, I mean, well said and completely true. I certainly did not enter martial arts at any stage, be it with that first judo class in college, going into the Taekwondo gym with Rob at that point in time, of being a person that was sports oriented and confident in my body and even in my larger capability and self. I came in with a lot of insecurity, and like I said, I quit many times along the way because I wanted to quit before the going got tough. I could prove to myself I could go this far, and then bailed, as I would quit and stop training along the way in many of those instances, and had a sense of that in Taekwondo at times that I might have done if I hadn't been in there with Rob. But the blessing of the two of us having that opportunity to start together, probably kept both of us going because it became a thing that we kind of did together. And even when we were in different classes, when things kind of split up between kids and adults, it still became this common experience that we shared. And there was some motivation there that existed between us, encouraging each other along. And even when that kind of waned at some point in time because you reach on your own path. Ultimately, I, stuck with it because something was drawing me in terms of that growing sense of confidence and capability. But I'll tell you, some of the people that, that notion of whether it be imposter syndrome or just the insecurities that professional athletes and actors and business people talk about on other podcasts or in books that I read and listen to them. And you can show up having accomplished quite a bit and developed a certain amount of capability and still not feel completely confident in yourself or greatly, have a great lack of confidence and belief in yourself. And I've certainly carried that kind of sense through most of my life. It always roots back to childhood in some way, but
Mm-hmm.
that getting picked last long enough kind of does something to you as a kid, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And only child and single parent mom, and just a lot of those kind of dynamics that just don't give you the foundation that you need to enter life more confident and capable. And so it becomes part of an exploration of getting to that point. And as it turned out for me, that notion of showing up and sticking with martial arts practice as a student, as an instructor, whether I was doing it solely at some point in time as a Taekwondo instructor or mixed in while I was doing other work, it was giving me more handholds along the way to keep climbing to places where I might climb and to feel good about the, whatever height I was getting to. Just recently, my work challenges, they've been greater because it's pushed me to use a greater variety of skills that I may or may not feel I had in terms of, running a program well and leading a team well under some tough circumstances of, budget and staffing levels and student needs and just a variety of things and working some awful long hours, so it's even physically challenging, especially when maybe you get a little older, having sleep problems. And what actually got me reoriented is I spent my morning special hour of time I take early in the morning reading, writing, journaling, meditating, praying, whatever combination it might be on a given day. I kind of loop back around to Taekwondo. And as the universe does, not only did that come to mind for different reasons, and in terms of drawing upon those roots and especially the tenets of Taekwondo, like what's it mean to have gotten a fifth degree black belt in Taekwondo and multiple black belts in a couple other martial arts along the way of my Taekwondo journey, and to have taught as I did, and to have those five tenets be something that I could reflect back on. And my mind just went there to draw upon those to support me and drive me in the work I'm doing at the lighthouse in my job now. And that was supported by serendipitously and randomly having two or three past students from years ago encounter me in public and greet me and just say how special their Taekwondo experience was and what a difference I made in their lives or their kids' lives. And, we're going back 20 years
Mm-hmm.
in many of those cases. And this just all popped up at the same time. I kind of needed to reinforce that message. And so, however things conspired to bring that all in front of me, the bottom line is it came down to me looking at what I'd accomplished, what I could have hanging on the wall. I don't have my certificates hanging anywhere at this moment. And the belt around my waist, what that met with the years of experience and those tenets I referenced, the courtesy, integrity, self-control, and then especially that perseverance and indomitable spirit. I just went back to those as, part of the package of core values and purpose that I could apply to the work I'm doing, which is, at this point, I'm probably most challenged in my work environment as I've been in my entire life. So I figure maybe that means I'm actually capable of taking it on because of everything I've done in my entire life and the challenges put in front of me because I'm supposed to figure out how to take it on. So.
Mm-hmm. You touched on a lot of really interesting topics that I wanted to bring up there. Uh, One was the some of the benefits that you've derived from martial arts outside of just the world
Mhm,
of Taekwondo or
mhm,
karate or
mhm,
other martial arts you developed, and part of that
Mhm,
was the five tenets of Taekwondo that you
mhm,
almost drilled into us. It was
mhm.
courtesy, integrity, self-control, perseverance, and dominable spirit. To
Yes.
this day, I have that lingering in the back of my head, and
Mhm,
one of the habits that I like to do daily is I have a little reminder that I read every morning of these are my goals for the year, and then at the bottom I have a little thing of this is what I want to live my life by. And while it's not directly the same as the five tenets of Taekwondo, it definitely draws on many of those aspects of
mhm,
like be courteous, be honorable in everything that you do, have integrity in the things you do. You are ultimately in control of yourself, and if you work through it, like if you dedicate yourself to a craft and you persevere, you're going to improve over time. It might not be
mhm,
fast, it's probably going to be very slow, it's probably going to be painful, but you can improve over time. That you have to decide if you're going to be taken down or not. You have to build that indomitable spirit for yourself. So beyond beyond that, and what you've already mentioned this a bit, but what have been some of the skills or benefits that you've derived from martial arts as a whole outside of that world?
Um, well, yeah, I just have to take it back to, having something to do with like tenets being introduced. The Interestingly, two related concepts to that, because those were even in the context of like being active in church as a Christian, and you have certain values that you are espoused there, and that you want to take into your life and live because that's a big part of your life. Those Taekwondo tenets stood out because it was a daily, at some point in time, daily, initially weekly at least, put in front of you, hanging on a wall, talked about in some way. And, they're kind of done as a take them or leave them kind of thing. But if you take them, take them or leave them in terms of, you don't do classes on tenets at a Taekwondo school. They might be hanging on a wall. They come up in discussion every now and then, but they're not necessarily, as you said, drilled into. It's like I made it a point to drill those in a little more because I realized that that's ultimately what it was all about. You could show
Mm-hmm.
up in a Taekwondo class and, you could have multiple disabilities. You could show up blind and incapacitated physically in some other way beyond blindness, and maybe be in a wheelchair and show up and getting a lot out of class, because if you can walk away with those tenets in you and living them and drawing upon them in some way, you've just gotten you know a powerful life that you can never really get physically in
Mm-hmm.
Taekwondo. And you don't have to be blind or disabled to not get it from Taekwondo, because every black belt is not an Olympic athlete. You know what I mean? It's uh, I'm happy to say that in our particular system, black belt and color belt tests were, they're pretty good tests. They
Mm-hmm.
weren't a gimme. People who did have to work and accomplish them, and but regardless, that happened across a variety of people in terms of what that looks like. Um, but the tenets of the walkaway. But I reference those, whatever other principles you might draw upon in life, and especially if you come from a faith tradition, perhaps. But two that became important for me that loop around with the tenets are some of the well, initially the leadership camp work I was involved in with Rotary in our Rotary district around here, and then subsequently kind of branched off with a Rotary partner into some business leadership oriented training or team training. The notion of mission statement came into play there. The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People was one of the foundational tools that was used with the youth and then by us later on, and looping a lot of stuff into it. And what comes up in that book is uh, the notion of a mission statement. It goes with the habit to begin with the end in mind, which can be bigger life planning, but ultimately it's really like, what's your legacy? And what was the purpose that you were working toward, and did you accomplish it, and did you leave that in the world? And so that mission becomes more personal in terms of less so what you do, more so how you do it. And I almost, I got introduced to that concept, probably in my late 40s initially, and had a hard time with it because it's like, man, if I kind of state this and write it down, I gotta commit to it,
Hmm.
and maybe I'm not going to be capable of living up to whatever I put down in a mission statement. I could blow it big time. So,
It becomes a
and then
tangible promise you make to yourself, and you know to
yeah,
yourself that I can dedicate myself to this now, and it's up to me to decide if I'm going to.
yeah, writing it down. And the difference between just reading about Taekwondo tenets on a wall, and if you every morning wrote them down and looked at them and said, how am I going to live those today? How am I going to bring those to my life? I mean, that's where the rubber hits the road, and at least you get to start doing it when you're in the Taekwondo gym. If you're reminded of, you just like to like kick this partner in the head, and you think of courtesy,
Hmm.
for
It.
whatever reason, or the fact that you're completely blowing something that you're trying to get because you just don't have it yet, or it seems physically beyond you at the moment, and you think of perseverance and indomitable spirit. So you need a chance to live them and have them in front of you. But I finally got around to a mission statement, which doesn't sound anything like the tenets. But after some years of playing around and then starting to commit to wanting to find what really sung for me, I finally hit it in terms of, what am I really all about with my life, and that's ultimately the mission statement idea. But you could also look at core values. That's a concept that I played with and realized it was the same as my mission statement. But
Hmm.
a somewhat recent book, The Practice of Groundedness by Brad Stolberg. I came across a couple of his books, that being one of them. Uh, More recent, and he gets at the notion of core values at least. And as I looked at that a little bit, realized that no, it comes across in what I've established. And so I had nothing about Taekwondo in tenets in my mission statement as I've had it, but I still went back to draw upon those, as I said more recently, and they provided the extra push and perspective that I needed to start to take stuff on more. And so now and mentally each day they sit kind of like side by side in column two of my mental journal page, of my mission statement on one side and my five tenets of Taekwondo on the other. So
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's amazing what you can take away from. It's amazing what you can take away from like any practice that you do. And most people, when they think about martial arts and the things you can derive from it, they think of the physical power that they can get. They think of the physical capabilities of being able to train themselves, being able to protect themselves. But just as importantly, or maybe even sometimes even more importantly, you can derive like mental benefits. You can derive life principles that you can live by. And I say that the five tenets were drilled into me because I distinctly remember like, at least once or twice a year we would have a day almost dedicated to those five principles that we would like throughout our training. Instead of yelling whenever we would strike something, we would go through the principles, and as we would kick someone up well, as we would kick someone in the head or kick the target that would represent their head, we would say we would shout courtesy, integrity, self-control, and go through the entire we'll just keep on repeating those over and over again to essentially drill them into us. So
that's great you mentioned that. I'd forgotten that I had you guys do that. So
mm-hmm. Yeah.
it was just meant to be a learning tool for remembering the tenets as well as kind of, think about them a little bit. But
Mm-hmm.
uh, uh, I guess there were a number of learning approaches and tricks and tools that you kind of pull out from somewhere along the years that way, and then you forget you ever did them. It's like, "Ah, I wish I wrote all those down."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. There are some things
Yes,
I've taught people that I think to myself, ah, oh, I wish I remember how I did that.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but
Well, there's the expression that was often used when you're well, older in any area, but it came up in Taekwondo a few times in terms of younger, newer people. As maybe I wasn't younger, but I was newer at some point in time, and you think your perspective and perspective on a situation, your perspective on a technique, whatever it might be, that it's valuable because you're having this insight and this, and you realize later on that I didn't know crap, um, and
mm-hmm.
it was something that would get mentioned at times is for some of the folks that have been around a while, higher level black belt is in terms of techniques at least, and we've forgotten 10 times more than you've even learned at this point in time. And that's true in and of itself, but that humility part of that is, well, yeah, you retain some stuff too, but Yeah, there is an awful lot of stuff that you end up learning along the way if you're in an actively learning system like we were.
Hmm.
And you can't practice it and know it and retain it all. You know, you kind of hang on to what's core and key for you and maybe what's required in different ways. But
Yep.
it's so much gets lost that way. But hopefully you can hang on to the most essential, be it a tenet or be it a technique or a mindset, whatever it might be. You know, there's certain stuff you don't want to lose and let go.
Hmm. So, last thing I want to touch on when it comes to martial arts or starting the martial arts journey, we're talking to someone who is just starting or interested in just starting now. What would
Mhm.
be some skills or practices that you might recommend someone study that might help them with like preparing to learn martial arts? Or what are some good foundational skills that they could have as they're stepping into the world of martial arts?
That's a good question in terms of pre-prep. It, Partly, I just want to say, if you're interested in martial arts, don't use wherever you're at now, um, mentally or physically, as a reason to not start. I certainly showed up not ready to be engaged in Taekwondo practice, but I prepared and got better and stronger and more capable by showing up. And so the solution was also, there's some expression I could probably pull out of that exists, and I can't hit upon it, but that's the answer. You don't get fit to go do martial arts. You don't get stronger in order to go do martial arts. It might depend on the context. I mean, if you're going to a place where you really are getting into it pretty hard with each other, grappling and all, unless it's a good program that would support people a variety of skill levels, you could probably get pretty discouraged if you're going in tight and weak, in some way. But by and large, the vast majority of programs that someone would walk into, it's going to be the answer to what you want to go in with, be it the physical preparation, be it the mental mindset to be able to go learn. It's like if it's a decent enough program, you start and it's the movie scene. The weak, unconfident kid ends up with whatever old master someplace, and over time of learning techniques, waxing on, waxing off, and kicking tree trunks or whatever, you get developed up into the person and fighter that you are. It
Mm-hmm.
happens in the process of learning the martial art. That being said, I point out to students now, especially because many people in general, but it definitely exists within, say, the population of people who are blind or visually impaired that I work with, and particularly if they're a long time lost their vision or never had vision and didn't get involved in physical activity. They're deprived of opportunities to develop physically, and just that when it comes to self-defense, when that's a concern, which it is particularly in the folks that I'm working with right now. You go out into the world. What's going to hold you back from wanting to live independently and take on challenges as someone who's blind in society, in college, workforce, traveling in public is, a concern about personal safety. And taking care of yourself physically, big challenge for anybody potentially, and and maybe especially in the group I'm working with. Um, but I point out that, kind of looping back to earlier in the interview, it's all tools in your toolbox. Is your skills that you learn are tools in the toolbox, but they might not be enough in and of themselves. And then your physical fitness and your capability and using your body, getting more comfortable using your body, that carries an awful lot of weight. The fighter in a match that's most fit and better conditioned and stronger, or by virtue of their strength, maybe faster, that's an advantage when everything else is equal. But that might not be enough because maybe someone does surprise you or has really outstanding technique or something. It's the mix of the two. So if you want to go in and you really haven't been physically active and you're wondering if you can handle it, then spend some time just doing something. If you're not even walking a whole lot, get out and walk a lot. Do jumping jacks, start yoga, just something to feel like you at least got a small foundation of using your body and understanding a little bit, and maybe just slightly, after even just a month, you're kind of like, hey, I actually feel a little bit better about myself. Well, go start the martial arts now. You know,
Mm-hmm.
if you waited up to that point in time, don't use that as the excuse to wait too long. But if it's really necessary just to get over a little hump of confidence and how you feel about yourself at that point in time, just do something, and use your body because ultimately the two have to go together. If it's not going to be real martial arts and real capability unless you work the technique hard, practice a lot of repetition of basic fighting principles and mix it in with just get in better shape, you know.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Having some sort of physical foundation you can build from helps out a lot. It's not necessarily needed if you are just starting out, but it will help you in the long run if you do work on developing that physical foundation that can really aid you in martial arts. There's one other thing that it's sort of been hinted at a little bit through your answers somewhat throughout this interview that I want to also touch on, and that's the how do I phrase this properly? It's that often a lot of people want to do things, but very few people will actually go out and do them. Very few people will actually go out and try to do the things. Uh, you started and stopped martial arts for many years before you finally hit Taekwondo and started that with your son and kept going with that. There's there's one thing that I feel like I always want to touch on through every interview that involves people going out and trying to learn new skills, and that's that a lot of times people will go out and say, I want to do this thing, but they never take action to go and do it. The person who decides or says they're going to do something and then actually goes and takes action is probably like they've taken more steps than anyone who says, I'm going to do the thing and never attempts it. So, really, I feel like one of the biggest and best skills that you can have, one of the biggest aids that you can have going into martial arts, and you mentioned this earlier, is being willing to suck as a beginner, being willing to go into it understanding and knowing that I don't know everything. I'm going to suck for a while. I can go into this with the mentality of a beginner, knowing that I can go into this and get better and improve and really try something instead of being held back or stuck by that fear of, oh, like, the fear of going in and being a beginner and not wanting to be that, not wanting to experience that again.
Well, I think of at first I wasn't thinking of this, but it can tie right into the Taekwondo background specifically. Is one of the grandmasters within our system, the U.S. Grandmasters in the generation that were taught by Great Grandmaster Yuan. He had a pretty successful, he's retired now, Taekwondo system he developed in the southwest part of the state. And people that wanted to have successful in terms of, if you apply yourself at a certain level and really actually want to do and teach this and have a system that can support you financially as well as serve your students well. That's a very unique skill set and opportunity that sometimes you can't make it happen, even if you're skilled and you tried because the circumstances aren't right. But the one thing that he said once on the business side of stuff is that he just liked trying things,
Mm-hmm.
and and that he would try a new approach, new program, new type of offering, new way of doing something, and that more often than not it didn't work out, but because he just liked trying things and had fun doing that to see what would happen, he'd hit one every now and then, and it's like, wow, that really worked out well,
Mm-hmm.
and became foundational pieces. And to back it up from that, because that comes to mind every now and then, not in a business sense for me a lot of times, but just Grandmaster Lee just, mentioning that. And that kind of stuck with me, and it was a little, needling that I'd thought of along the way at times, because my mindset and my approach to a lot of things in living has been to look and analyze and read and think about it and fret about it and not take the step. And if I go back to the interests I had as a kid, not only would I have been in martial arts a lot sooner with hopefully good benefit, if it was a good program in terms of, what I needed as an individual, as a human. Uh, but that first step in other sports, maybe exercise. I was enamored with bodybuilding for a period of time because I imagined that that would give me the capability and confidence I needed if I could accomplish that. And yet, I'd spent more time reading about it than doing anything about it. Um, if I followed through on everything I had interest in as a kid, I would have three PhDs across different areas of science and engineering. It'd be a 50th degree black belt in 10 different martial arts, and I'd look like Arnold Schwarzenegger in his Terminator heyday,
Mm-hmm.
but didn't quite work out that way. Um, and so beyond the sucking beginner mindset idea, uh, it's even a little more fundamental in terms of just a mindset of exploration, play, being willing to try something, as came out with the one grandmaster's notion of, ideas that related to the business side of Taekwondo and programs. And I just recently, well, maybe going back a year ago now, maybe less than that. Here I am at that point, 62, maybe, otherwise 63, and had thought that my whole life, I had started guitar lessons as a kid and stopped for whatever reason, not terribly long. And your whole life, you kind of think it'd be cool to play guitar. It'd be cool to play guitar. Well, I just happened to see a Facebook post by a local teacher who happened to teach both of my kids, Tom O'Hara, and he said he had a couple of slots open left in his schedule for guitar students. And I just messaged him right away that night and just said, "Hey, Tom, would you like to take an older student?" And he would take any student, of course, but it was in the context of he had taught my kids, and he said, "Sure." So I started guitar lessons, and I'm still saying put them on pause because based on when he had available slots, it wasn't working with work at one point in time because my days got longer.
Mm-hmm.
And so I will return. There's no doubt about it because he loved having me as a student. We connected, he's a little in the ballpark of my age as well. So it was just a good time as well as the guitar learning to spend that half hour or 45 minutes together. But look at that gap in time there from probably, 10 years old was the last time I had my hands on a guitar as a guitar student. And then it's again at 63 years old. And it's just like, why not, So
Mm-hmm.
martial arts or whatever it might be, um, you know, just a little more mindset of if you get the idea, you're not making a lifelong commitment. You're not determining your place in the afterlife. You're just trying something. So go
Mm-hmm.
try it. And if you and you could be wrong, you could be right in terms of whether or not you really like it or it's not what it's cracked up to be, but you never know, but just try something. And as much as I never liked people who quit their Taekwondo training, I was probably too heavy-handed at times in trying to convince people to stick with it, or if not heavy-handed, at least strongly encouraging. Where now I might give people a little more freedom of that choice. That's okay. Quitting is underrated, probably. Because if you're focused on never quitting, you might not ever try some stuff. So just try it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, I agree with you there.
Yeah, yeah. Mhm.
So we've talked a
Try
lot.
podcasting, try writing, try, there's a lot of different things. Just try it.
Absolutely, try things,
Okay.
experiment,
Mhm,
like try
mhm,
things new, see if you like it. If you don't, move on to the
mhm.
next thing.
Yeah.
Like
Mhm,
like you said, you're
mhm,
not marrying the thing. You're not going to. You don't have to marry the thing and stick with it for
mhm,
the rest of your life.
mhm,
So we've talked a lot about martial arts and taekwondo, your experiences with it, and what people can do to learn from it to try to
mhm,
grow and develop these skills, where they can go, what they can do to really try to develop this skill of martial arts.
mhm.
And throughout this conversation, you've mentioned your work with a place called the Lighthouse. Can you tell me a bit more of what you've done, like outside the gym?
Um, sure. Well, boy, this a lot that flows in there because you referenced a couple of other things along the way. And It's definitely what I'm doing right now is well, one of the most unique things. Maybe somehow I'm attracted to unique things because certainly practicing martial arts is still a more unique thing. And
Mm-hmm.
particularly at the time I started, the approach in our particular Taekwondo system being, a little more on the hard ass side in many ways, especially going back to its earlier root times and even still at the time I started. And so taking a harder path and working with people who are blind, as such a small segment of society, and so outside the mainstream as people look at it. I guess it's all kind of pretty unique stuff. Um, So now that makes me wonder what's that all about. So
Hmm.
why did I end up attracted to and sticking with some things that way? Um,
It leads to an
but
interesting and unique life.
yeah, but I referenced well, that all goes back to the mission statement in the sense of following a call, of whatever sort that might be. Um, but I mentioned that, here I was operating at that point in time. I probably had the school in south of Duluth, a bit in Cloquet, you know where that is, and looking at ways of expanding it because at that point in time, I think the thing I mostly was doing was Taekwondo instruction with just a little smattering of other assisting consultative work in a couple of ways. But I wanted to have a big, a larger and more prosperous to actually make a little bit of money Taekwondo program. And driving by the lighthouse for the blind, as it was called back then, different name now, and just ask that question, what's up with blind people in self-defense? And I had my own small connection to the notion of, you know, uh, poor physical activity as a kid, being blind in one eye, being overweight, not feeling confident, capable, and little inkling in the back of my head just tied that all together. And I inquired and I did these cohorts. And the it was ultimately funded because a lot of the blindness training services are really funded by special federal dollars that are channeled through to the states. And it ultimately all has the purpose of having people be employed. It's largely how it's clustered. So there's not nearly as much funding available, I think, for having blind people. I should say people who are blind. Sorry, I want to put people first language. People who are blind or visually impaired in some way. Uh, Less funding available in many ways if you aren't oriented toward working and just want certain skills and opportunity to learn stuff. But if it's channeled through working, what's it mean to be work capable? Well, certainly if you're blind, then you have to be able to travel. You have to be able to, operate in a workplace. You have to be able to handle technology in different ways. There are all skills that can be taught, and remarkably so, as you'll learn once you get exposed to it. But you also have to be kind of like ready to work, like anybody else. But there might be unique barriers and perspectives on that for someone who's blind, in terms of traveling independently, different times of the day, being safe. And so it was funded as workplace readiness oriented training. And the idea was to get people feeling confident enough really to take on, a fuller, more independent life in the workplace. And did that on and off for a period of time. And then, even along the way in between, if I was doing some of the business club building work I was doing in BNI as a director consultant there, or the leadership training I was doing with Marty. Um, as we tried that, I finished those up, and leadership business. It was time to wrap it up. It wasn't working out like we thought, and I needed a job, and that was so here I am, older and looking at options, and lo and behold, there was a position advertised at the Lighthouse that I happened to see, and interviewed for that job. And the Lighthouse had the experience with me from the martial arts background and a little bit from the leadership training background, but uh, the director and team and director primarily really didn't want me for that job, even though I interviewed for it, which was more administrative. They had a job working with a youth program, a teen program that was potentially going to be open, or would be coming open down the line. And they just wanted to talk to me about that because they were familiar with my background in the martial arts as well as some other areas. And so I ended up getting that job as managing the youth transition program within the blindness training division. And so initially for the first 3 years, I guess it was probably focused just on teens as a target for independence and workplace related training skills, be it college in between or not. And then the opportunity came up to oversee the total blindness training division. So any of the training for adults through post high school through adult years that we might take on. And so I agreed to do that, and that's been the challenge, and I will still say blessing in that work because it's so unique. At the same time, I'm literally going crazy with how demanding it is at the moment.
Hmm.
And looping back around here, uh, stop at what I'm doing right now, which is really working in a whole new field and a whole new level of responsibility in terms of a position as division director, call it the manager of the division. It's a fancier title than role, but there's a lot of aspects to it. I do everything from teaching self-defense and teaching, workplace readiness skills in regards to you know, interview techniques and things you don't need certification in, as opposed to like, people that teach technology training, travel in the community with white cane or public transportation, living skills, using knives and fire and those sorts of things. You got to be, that's specialized certified training that not just anybody can do. But I contribute as I can as an instructor. I lead and coordinate the team. I'm responsible for a lot of other managerial duties and just the total package, and especially when you have staff changeovers and what have you, the leader and the boss ends up picking up the slack mostly to kind of take the load off a team, in some ways. So that's the position I
Mm-hmm.
ended up in. But I was able to reorient my mind after, hitting near crisis mode with it at one point in time when things just seemed insanely unmanageable. I went back to those Taekwondo tenets, like I referenced earlier,
Mm-hmm.
that just kind of like came back around one day, and that became the foundation, kind of like digging myself out of the mental, emotional, distress hole that I'd fallen into initially when the crap hit the fan, So,
Yeah. Could you tell me a bit of why do you do what you do?
um, something about one of the questions you gave me ahead of time, whether I asked that directly or not, got me thinking about the notion of what's the foundational thing that's kind of driven me, along the way, because that notion of what's it mean to be successful? What's it mean to, why do you do what you do? Just all those things wrapped in together. And what I've, well, what I hit upon as a short answer is basically I've always felt like I want to feel like I'm doing something that's making a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it doesn't matter if the work is paying a lot, if it's recognized. Those are all important things. You need a certain amount of money, and validation and recognition is really important because when I'm not getting it, I feel undervalued, and less motivated. But that being said, that becomes part of the answer of feeling it's making a difference. Some people's sense of motivation, success in life, their vision for themselves, they can be feeling they're making a difference and be great people in the world and be very focused on certain aspects of career achievement, financial success. Nothing wrong with that necessarily, but those things are oftentimes the cart and not the horse for some people, and they don't quite realize that, I think. And with me, I recognize at this point in time that the only time I'm really like putting my heart into something and willing to do my best and willing to sacrifice and persevere and take something and do something with it is, I've got to feel like I'm really making a difference and contributing to something. And that certainly became the case in Taekwondo. As I went through more years of realizing that it wasn't about how good and confident I felt about myself. It was really about what I could do for other people that way and what I could give them. And same thing at the lighthouse. What's motivating on the toughest days is that, I can support my team so that they're able to do their work and show up and feel fulfilled. And in my direct contact with students, I'm able to try to foster a culture that really uplifts them and lets them know that, we got their back, so that they can accomplish their goals and dreams that they have as people who've, maybe midlife lost vision after working and thought they might never work again. And now we're at a place where there's a different vision of the future that they have because of what we can do for them, So um, that's ultimately what kind of drives me is back to the mission I referenced earlier, which is it turned into three sentences after a lot of playing around over some years. And so my mission that I go by and live by and look at every morning to get oriented is be an instrument of peace, be brave, and trust. And so I look at what I do as accomplishing that and drawing upon that to accomplish it, to be an instrument of peace with everything that might mean, And I do kind of think of what that pulls from some elements of that peace prayer that people know about, but that might be hope, that might be forgiveness, that might be love, that might be light and vision and possibility, uplifting people. That's part of showing up every day, and to do that requires being brave. And maybe that's where the Taekwondo tenets come in, perseverance, indomitable spirit, and then trusting that in the big scheme of things, if my heart's in the right place and I'm applying myself to good work, it might be hard. It might seem like it's failing. It just might not seem to be going anywhere. But if I go about it properly, I just trust it's going to work out and go the place it's supposed to go, and have that little sense of freedom and liberation that maybe it's about more than just me too. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If someone wants to get started, learn more either about martial arts or like giving back to a community or connect with you, where should they go next?
Oh, well, well, people could always just connect with me by finding me wherever they can find me. I
Mm-hmm.
assumed as part of the, if not show notes, introductory piece,
Yep.
you can put down contact points of, in my case at least, my email address is always public, but I do stay active just as an individual, no business or anything on Facebook, on Instagram, but I also started writing on Substack. I previously had a blog called An Unlikely Master, and then I kind of stopped that at some point. I was doing that while I was in Taekwondo, and trying to share larger life matters from the lens of Taekwondo. But then took a pause and then went back and started writing on Substack with draws upon, and I actually use that same name now, An Unlikely Master, as a kind of a name for the newsletter or the whatever it might be called, the Substack, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But I in the Substack, I go places that get more broad than I had previously, including spiritual perspective, because that's a important part of life and perspective for me, is how it all ultimately comes to spiritually, whether that be spiritual in a bigger sense or spiritual a little more religious at times, but um, can't deny that that's part of the whole package for many people as humans, and an important part of the package, so,
Great.
yeah. And I'm fine if anybody just happens to want to reach out to touch base for some reason, especially because right now there's some guy they heard talk about martial arts and his martial arts journey on your podcast, and they don't know who else to talk to about it before they go visit the place downtown in their city, wherever they are. Heck, I'm happy to talk with them, but mostly I'd say that place you're wondering about showing up at, just go show up sometime and check it out. So.
All right, fair enough. I'll put any links down in the show note to the description. Master Chris, I appreciate you taking the time to join me today. It's been an absolutely enthralling discussion, and just thanks for coming on.
Yeah, this has been fun. And again, I'm honored that being part of your past, that you sought to reach out and consider this to be a worthy conversation. And hope it does make a difference in some way to somebody. And otherwise, I've just enjoyed it. So,
Great. Once again, thanks.
yeah, take care. Bye.
Hey, you, listener. If you enjoyed this episode, then consider sharing it with a friend you think would like it, or share it on social media. Word of mouth is the best way to help a podcast grow, and we really appreciate it. With all that said, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to y'all later. Ciao.